Hi all, welcome back. I'm Norm Fenema. Today we are in our talks on World War II. We are looking at what I call the back door to Europe. So, and what Churchill called the soft underbelly, the approach of taking Europe from the Mediterranean, liberating it. Okay, so in that we're going to look at a bit of the tension between the American and the British planning, Battle of the Mediterranean, and get into the African campaign, which is absolutely fascinating. Introduced you to a lot of names here today, so hold tight and yeah. Anyway, nothing to it but to do it. Let's get started. First, I want to tell you a story of an individual who plays a role in this. And so here's a British guy who was born in 1908 to a very well-off family. His father's a member of parliament, in fact, till he dies in service in World War I. Young Ian goes to Eton College, and just like Churchill's son Randolph does, George Orwell, a contemporary, Anthony Eden, the Foreign Secretary under Chamberlain, etc., etc., the aristocrats of England. He's not a high achiever. He is a good athlete, and he's a real womanizer, which is enough to get him expelled, and also from his dorm and his college, and also get the clap. For those who don't know, that is an STD. Anyways, ends up going to Austria. He's at loose ends, gets engaged, comes home, kind of unemployable, tries and fails to get a job in the foreign service after passing the test, but not with great marks. His mother ends up getting him a job. She pulls some strings to get him a job as a reporter, and also makes him cancel his wedding or be cut off from the family money. All sounds very British. And then gets into a relationship with another woman who dies in the Blitz, unfortunately, in a bombing campaign. And then he has this affair with a wealthy baroness. So far, so typical of a British aristocrat. You've seen this movie. But meantime, as the war starts, he's joined the Royal Navy in 1939, and specifically he's in the intelligence branch. And he proves that he's pretty good at coming up with new, really outlandish deception campaigns, dozens of them in fact, and they're detailed in what is called the Trout Memo. And there's some absolutely crazy ones in there that never see the light of day. But yeah, he succeeds. He ends up working with the OSS chief, Colonel Donovan, the head of what will be the CIA. And he also comes up with this idea for a unit of commandos. He's inspired by the British and their expertise on that, or what they'd done in Crete, in fact, where they had agents working at the front lines using all these creative espionage means to steal documents. So he wants to do that to the Germans. This happens, and it's called 30 Assault Unit. And eventually he's got 150 men and women operatives, many of whom don't like him very much, given his aristocratic and somewhat detached leading from the back, which he's not allowed to lead from the front anyway. Anyways, not a lot of love lost there. He calls them his Red Indians in the language of the day. Anyway, along with that too, he directed naval intel in the planning for D-Day. It's pretty significant. And then all this, and then like everyone, 1945, he gets demobilized. Uh, and like a lot of people who had these high-flying and exciting careers during the war, he gets depressed and restless. Very common experience. Early 1950s finds him, as he said to his friends, needing a distraction from his wedding plans, and so in one short month, he fires off what he calls his dreadful opus, which is this 2,000 words a day he's typing, and it's a book based on his wartime experiences, and also a lot of his own life as a philanderer, to put it politely. Calls the book Goldeneye, and his hero is Agent 007. He'll write a dozen more or so, and none are very good. In fact, they get terrible reviews, but all very popular. And that's especially true after John F. Kennedy lists Dr. No, a subsequent novel, as one of his favorite 10 books, which might have been to do Ian Fleming a favor because they knew each other. Anyway, his agents assign a 6-movie deal with Sean Connery as the lead, and the rest is history. As was Ian Fleming himself, who dies 3 years later at the age of 56, mainly because of that lifestyle that James Bond also embodied. Very heavy drinker and very heavy smoker. All right, so that is the story of James Bond, and a reminder too that the Allies on intel really excelled. Okay, so it's more than just a cute story. It's a reminder that intelligence really did shorten the war, and this is where the Allies had a significant lead over the Germans. Okay, now bringing us back to the story of the soft underbelly and the Africa campaign, here's a famous picture to start us off. It's taken in Quebec, Quebec City, and this is at one of a couple dozen wartime conferences that happened between the Allied command, and one of only seven key high-level meetings. There were two in Quebec, and those high-level meetings began with the Atlantic Conference in Newfoundland before the war. They end in Potsdam in 1945. Any case, here in Quebec, the Allies first agreed to launch an invasion, a liberation of Western Europe, but no timeline is set. Which is what the British prefer. And in fact, already in 1942, the Americans have been pushing hard to go very shortly after joining the war. So their plan, take France, roll on to Berlin, easy peasy, lemon squeezy, get it done right away. FDR really wants a win prior to the 1942 midterm elections as part of it, but the British are completely not agreeable to that. In fact, had Churchill had his way, the operation which became known as Overlord D-Day would never have happened. Now, there's a lot written on this, and it was actually a pretty major sore spot between the two allies. The Americans really felt that the British were not cooperative. They're completely right. But this too is far from the only point of division between them. And at one point, a really low point between them is at the first Cairo conference, where Admiral King, the head of the U.S. Navy, is in these shouting matches with the British staff, and he has to be held back at one point from getting physical with the chief of the British staff, Sir Alan Brooke, who's this famously stubborn and difficult man, which is true of a lot of the principles you'll meet in today's talk. Anyway, King is infamous as being hot-headed. You could say he's even-tempered in that he's always in a rage. FDR said he shaved every morning with a blowtorch, so it makes sense. But what Churchill and his chief of staff want, and what's so frustrating to the Americans, is a periphery strategy. Specifically, they propose something called Operation Jupiter, which is to take Norway and Finland, and also Africa. They see these as winnable campaigns at the point of the greatest Axis weakness. Now, the Americans are really impatient with that. Their military planners dismiss this as quote-unquote scatterization. And they really believe you need to concentrate for a decisive blow. U.S. Secretary of War gets the winning quote on this. He says what's really going on here is a fatigued and defeatist government, i.e. Britain, versus this young and vigorous nation, America. That's Harry Stimson, U.S. Secretary of War. What's really happening here, though, in these squabbles between the British and Americans is something a lot broader, and basically what it is completely different military doctrines that are colliding. American way of war is about overwhelming firepower, a preponderance of firepower, aiming straight at your enemy's jugular. Very simple. It's a war of annihilation. And you can see that in pretty much every battle, allegedly from the Revolution, definitely in the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. And that's the premise of this famous book by Russell Weigley, which has basically stood the test of time. What I say basically is because yes and no, other military historians see a real shift after the war towards precision and technology, though the approach in Vietnam really makes me wonder about that. But yeah, they see after the war rise in a shift to technology over manpower, which reflects his cultural shift to risk aversion, minimizing casualties. And so in that way, yeah, his views have been revised somewhat, but his view on strategy up to and including World War II is bang on accurate, and it's a must-read book if you want to understand the American way of war. British, very different. They rely, as you probably know, on naval power. They never had a big army. They always had the world's biggest navy, and they're forced to be more adaptive and creative without a big standing army, or you might call that flexible and opportunistic. And divide and conquer is their tried and true strategy because of that. Using your enemy's enemy And this is how they really created the world's largest empire. This is how they took India with a handful of British soldiers only. Most people in the empire had never laid eyes on a British soldier. In fact, even though the British end up turning them into a part of their empire and their colonies. Weak army, limited resources at home as well, so this makes total sense. Okay, so the British are about short, winnable campaigns, divide and conquer. And in World War II, then their preference is for avoiding the full weight of German might. Now, there's more to it. They also in a situation by this time where the losses just keep piling up. So there's a fear factor here as well. And that begins with the Norway disaster. There's that insanely quick, strange defeat in France. Then that repeats in Greece. It happens in the Eastern Theater against the Japanese, Singapore being the best example. It's loss upon loss upon loss. And Churchill is paying the price in ways that people don't remember. He's being accused by this point, by 1942, of mismanaging the war. There's even 2 votes of non-confidence on him in Parliament. He survives those, but still, yeah. In any case, post-war revisionist critics of the Allies believed Churchill favored Africa because it was a faster access to Eastern Europe, and he wants to beat Stalin by getting to those countries before the Soviets do. That this is all about anticipating the Cold War. Now, there's no evidence at all that he's thinking that way. In fact, the evidence runs in the opposite direction, that he's really willing to cede those countries. Yes, he foresees a Cold War, but he's more than willing to cede the Eastern Bloc, what becomes the Eastern Bloc, to the Soviet, that those become Soviet control, part of the Soviet periphery. We'll get back to that later. But in any case, that said, so revisionist arguments, forget about it. Egypt is key to the British Empire, so that's an important part of Churchill's thinking. The Suez Canal, right? The oil, which keeps the war machine going and comes from the Middle East through the Suez Canal. So this plays a big part in the British favoring that front. Churchill also knows that England cannot lose a big amphibious assault. So if you try that, they don't have what it takes if it fails for a second attempt. Americans completely different. They have no humiliations here to vindicate, and also they're only getting stronger with time. But mainly, yeah, it's 2 ways of warfare, 2 different mindsets. Now, the British strategy in 1942 then is negotiations, and keep them up, but really it's never commitment to anything. It's instead redirect. Okay, so agree in principle, but always defer in terms of specifics. And though 1942 seemed unlikely, even to some Americans, because of logistics we don't have to get into, they have a plan codenamed Bolero, and that's for a cross-channel invasion in 1943. And they also come up with a plan called Operation Sledgehammer, which is their backup plan then when they give up on 1942, a contingency plan to do 1942, to have this operation of liberating a cross-channel invasion in 42 if the Soviet Union falls to the German army. So, yeah, so they will go for 1942 still. That's the American preference, depending on what happens in the Eastern Front. But 1943 is acceptable as the absolute. Okay? But Churchill convinces FDR to help out in Africa until they're ready, right? Until 1943 comes along. So in the meantime, and this is against the wishes of Roosevelt's generals, who are right that in the end, Africa means diverted resources, and it tied up U.S. forces till 1943 wouldn't work anymore. And that's just as the British had probably expected. Okay? Consensus now is that the U.S. was really not ready to go to war in 1942, but there's still a historiographical debate about 1943 and whether it should have happened, and the idea that they should have launched a cross-channel invasion that summer. And the main evidence for that is that the Germans gained a whole year to build their defenses on the coast, the famous Atlantic Wall, to put a lot more divisions here, fortify that, and especially panzer divisions. In any case, that's a solid argument. But if the Americans were unhappy with the turn of events, Stalin it should be noted, is furious. He's pushing as hard as he can for a second front as soon as possible to take the pressure off the Eastern bloodletting. And he suspects the other Western allies of preferring Eastern bloodletting so they can take over the world after the Soviet Union collapses. So yeah, he tears into Churchill when they next meet for deferring on a cross-channel invasion in 42 and in 43. So the U.S. Plans for Operation Roundup come about, and that is invasion in spring 1943 and Operation Sledgehammer contingency plans for 42 if USSR fails. Churchill agrees in principle while playing the soft underbelly card, and as I said, getting FDR to agree to Africa. Now, all of that is by way of saying that as of June 1942, it is agreed that there will be a joint ops invasion of the North African colonies of Vichy France, preparatory in the British way of thinking to an invasion of Italy, the soft underbelly, which is supposed to, in their way of thinking, will be easy. They're anything but right on that one. Now, the situation here in Africa at the time is that on the eastern side, the British have been fighting the Italians already since 1940 from their base in Cairo, and all of that is led by one General Wavell. Okay? The French Vichy regime in the west is in firm control of French North Africa under a man named Francois Darlan, who we've met before. The British, though, still have Gibraltar, and Wavell had recaptured, liberated Ethiopia from the Italian army in this long 1.5-year battle, which ended in November 1941. The British have also been entrenched in Eastern Africa for a very long time. They've been in Egypt since the 1880s. They've been in East Africa itself since the early 1800s. There's older colonies south of Egypt going all the way down to South Africa. There's Sudan, there's Kenya. And the French controlled West Africa for about 100 years by this time, though they've been here much, much longer. The French have outposts going back to the 1500s in Oran, Algiers, Casablanca, and all of those places, those cities have major French populations. Algeria has over 1 million French Europeans, and yeah, it's been managed as home provinces, home departments of France. That's the fantasy that the French have, that these are actually part of France. And yes, some very famous Frenchmen are from here. Albert Camus, the famous French philosopher, he lives here in Oran. But now it is in Vichy hands under Francois Darlan. And he's not just collaborated with the Nazis, he's offering French support to help invade England. And he only starts to change his tune after the German loss at Stalingrad. He sees the winds changing and he wants to save his post-war career. He's a real piece of work. Now, recall too that Africa is Mussolini's theater, all right, in terms of the Axis power, and his navy controls most of the Western Mediterranean. British, as I said, still control Gibraltar, and they're hanging on with their fingernails to Malta. Malta, this super important island, given its location, and it's midway between Egypt and Gibraltar, and also obviously between Europe and Africa. So very important spot, and which becomes very unfortunate for the people who live there, as they suffer 2.5 years of bombardment and an Italian siege trying to dislodge British control here. And this is all part of the bigger Battle of the Mediterranean, which is not well known, but it rages for a long time, 1940 to 1943. And this is all about Italy and Germany trying to keep supply lines to Africa, hang on to the Mediterranean, which strategically, geopolitically makes sense in other ways, and the UK and the Allies trying to hang on to this critical base and by extension the Mediterranean, and sinking those Axis supply ships in this battle with really good numbers. They want to safeguard their access to the Suez Canal, as I've said. So this is an amazing battlefront. Okay? You see the Axis here lose over 150 submarines. Both sides lose dozens of warships. And after the siege of Malta is broken by the British, the Royal Navy goes on to sink over 3,000 Axis supply ships, just an incredible number. And they do that from this single base in Malta. So that's 60% of the Axis ships here for the rest of the war. Now, the background to these long battles on the British side is that Mussolini had wanted to add Egypt and the Sudan to his Impero Italiano, and he invades both of those and then gets repelled from both of them. Uh, in fact, in that, the British managed to retake Ethiopia and return Haile Selassie to his throne. Now, this is a repeat of the Italian army's big fail in taking Greece, where they're driven back through Albania, which they'd already had. Um, in this, the Italian to British killed in action is a staggering 15 to 1. So major failure on the part of Mussolini's armies. And a large part of General Waddell's success is one Colonel Wingate. And that's because he uses guerrilla tactics here. He's relying on locals, and he calls them Gideon's Force. He also has South African and colonial troops, the KAR, the King's African Rifles, in on this. Uh, yeah, and like I said, super lopsided battles here. Right? May of 1941, Haile Selassie is escorted back to his capital of Addis Ababa, and that makes Ethiopia the first country to be liberated from Axis control in World War II. On the Egyptian front, the Italians also invade with a much larger army, 4 times the size of the Allies, but they're pushed back. And they're not just pushed back, they're pushed back 600 miles into Libya. And this by the British and Commonwealth forces of Australia and India. Also, interestingly, fighting with them is what's called the Free French Army, and this was that force created by Charles de Gaulle as he retreated from France and headquartered there in London. And in fact, they fight in almost every major Allied campaign of the war, the Free French Army. The British and the Allies, they make it all the way to Benghazi, pushing the Italians back, and then there's a bit of back and forth, but it all ends with Graziani's Italian 10th Army completely decimated, and over 130,000 Italians taken prisoner, which is their entire army group. Now, this is akin to some of those huge encirclements that we saw in Russia by the Germans, and this is the first major Allied military offensive in North Africa. But the Allies will get pushed all the way back, and that's really what's unique about desert warfare. It's about vast distances and these huge long drives. And that's largely because there's pretty much a zero chance of concealment in the desert. You can't have flanking maneuvers without being seen. And then you got added to that in North Africa that the fighting has to be along the coastline because a couple dozen miles inland, sometimes as wide as 36 or wider, but you've got the Qatari Depression, which is impassable for tanks and vehicles. Now, it is this huge Italian loss that has Hitler send the Wehrmacht to this front. Okay? And historians have debated ever since whether that was a mistake on Hitler's part, because the African front means, and the main reason for that, it means diverting men and material from the Eastern Front, these tanks, troops, aircraft that are desperately needed there. It also means the Germans are overextending their logistics because it's very difficult to get supplies to Africa with the Royal Navy sinking thousands of their ships. On the other hand, Hitler's decision had a strong potential upside because had Roma managed to take Egypt and the Suez, and that's another debate whether that could ever have happened. But then, had that happened, the Germans would have controlled the flow of oil from the Middle East, and that would be super consequential for the British, tie down their war machine, essentially, not completely. And also, if nothing else, it would keep the British tied down in this sector. Okay? Either way, it is a reactive move on the part of Hitler, and it ends up costing hundreds of thousands of Axis casualties and prisoners. But it doesn't start out that way, and that is thanks to the brilliance of Erwin Rommel. Okay? Erwin Rommel, Hitler put him in charge of this new Afrika Korps and sends him down. Initially, this is just 16,000 men, but it will double before long. Now, Rommel, his name's come up before. He's a general with World War I experience. He's very popular because he leads from the front, not the rear, like most generals. And he's very savvy. In fact, he gets that nickname Desert Fox from his enemies, the British, which is a compliment. And as soon as he lands, he pushes the British back to Egypt. So, complete reversal. And also completely unauthorized. His orders have been to defend the Italian position, but he takes the initiative. And again, that fits in with that long tradition of operational independence that works so well for Germany. And Rommel himself had proven that already in France when he had, without authorization, basically took France in that massive assault across northern France to the coast. So again, another example, exactly the same kind of thing. Also, he's technically subordinate to the Italian command here, but he becomes the de facto leader of all the Axis forces in Africa. Now, in this rout of the British, this return, he also lays siege at this point to Tobruk. Now, this is a key Allied port on the coast where you have this famous holdout of the Australians at massive losses. And they become known as the Desert Rats by Radio Berlin, which they also take as a compliment. In any case, Rommel gets just inside Egypt, and at that point we get a 4-month stalemate. For a couple of reasons, it's a stalemate, and one is that what I've said before, you have this impassable salt marches to the south, and so you don't have any chance for these big flanking maneuvers on either side. So what we get are a few battles as Rommel tried to get past this point, but his biggest problem is that his nearest supply base is now 1,300 kilometers away in Tripoli. Okay, to put that in perspective, the distance from the Soviet western border to Moscow was 1,000 kilometers. This is further than that. This would take you into the Urals. And in terms of the coast, the British have the upper hand. They're really successfully disrupting those Axis supply lines. So June of 1941 is a stalemate, and into this flies Winston Churchill, and he's furious at how badly the Brits have done. And his solution is to fire Wavell, who's done a stellar job to this point. He sends him to India. He replaces him with General Alexander, who later is the Canadian Governor General, but also with Bernard Montgomery, who's this famously prickly egotist, who's nevertheless is a real hero to his men. Now, to look at what Wavell, how that was so unfair, is he'd been given this impossible task. And on one side, he'd been expected to keep the whole Middle East in British hands. And he manages to do that. He has battles in Lebanon and Syria with the Vichy French on the front that most don't know about, because they were moving into British Palestine, which is today's Israel and Gaza. And then, when Wavell had driven into Libya, he managed to take and destroy that Italian army, as I said. At that point, though, and this is really important, he's told, after he does that, he's told by Churchill to go to Crete, okay, and to hold it from what they knew was this imminent invasion by the Axis powers. So at that point, he said that would be disastrous because now he'd be undermanned and spread thin in Africa. But Churchill demands it, and what happens is he fails in Crete, and which becomes another British evacuation. Meantime, this divided British forces situation is a big part of the calculus for Hitler in deciding to send in Rommel to Africa to take advantage of these scattered British forces with the results that I just mentioned. So it's really this stalemate outside Cairo is Churchill's fault. Okay, and that gets to the fact that overall Churchill is a very skilled diplomat. He's that's obvious, right? But architect really of that Anglo-American alliance and why it stays as solid as it does. But that said, he's a pretty atrocious commander, which might sound shocking. And yes, he has moments of real vision, but he also has a lot more moments of these really costly and micromanaged failures. Now, it matters that he's both the prime minister and the commander-in-chief, which that doesn't mean a conflict. And but by personality, he involves himself immediately and intimately in wartime planning, in a way that someone with the intelligence of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was smart enough not to do, or had an instinct not to do, except for in those rare moments when he really has to step in. Churchill, like Hitler, is impatient. He keeps telling his generals to strike without really having a full grasp of the situation or a respect for what his generals can do or what they're up against. Uh, and in fact, Wavell's firing was the first of 4 dress changes here. When Churchill arrived, he first appointed General Auchinleck from India. Now, Auchinleck is another military genius, notwithstanding his apparent penchant for young Indian boys, but he's this genius strategist. And most recently, he's this hero for securing Iraq in again, an unknown front of the war. He succeeded there in the context of an overthrow of the British-friendly government by these pro-Axis, anti-British Arabs, right? They're fascist aligned because of their enmity of the British. So what we get there was this 1 month long Anglo-Iraqi war, which ends with a British victory thanks to Auchinleck and a return of the Iraqi regency. So he had saved this really critical base from falling to the Germans, but more than that, he's a career soldier with decades of experience. But then Churchill, again, like Wavell, he blames Auchinleck for the failure to dislodge Rommel here. Okay, so after that, Auchinleck's short tenure, Churchill appoints another general, Gott, General Gott. Now, Gott ends up being killed on his way to Cairo when his plane is shot down by the Luftwaffe, so he doesn't happen. And then it finally falls to Montgomery and Alexander. Now, like Churchill, Montgomery is very impetuous, which to Churchill means he's got the right stuff. And yes, he proves to be a very good choice. The thing about Montgomery, though, is he's not a team player. And Churchill recognized that. He had this great quote, and Churchill always does, of course. He says of Monty, in defeat, he's unbeatable. In victory, he's unbearable, which is pretty awesome. But the reason Montgomery succeeded where Wavell and Auchinleck could not, and Gott never had the chance, is really not on him, but it's a change in intelligence in British intel, because the Allies had now just cracked the African cipher. So now for the first time they know Rommel's plans, they know his order of battle, and they know exactly what the Axis supply ship movements are. So it's intel here that's becoming effective and is a game changer. A lot of stuff. To keep things simple, the British now push Rommel way back, and they make it all the way to Libya. They take Tripoli, so it's a return of what had happened before under Wavell with the Italians. En route to that, they relieve that German siege of Tobruk. Okay, so success on the Allied side. But then, early 1942, Rommel hits back, and he gets all the way to within 60 miles of Cairo at a place called El Alamein. This time, he takes Tobruk back and doesn't lay siege. He finally takes it and takes about 35,000 Allied prisoners. Now it's July in 1942, and what we get is a series of counterattacks, but nothing really happens outside El Alamein here. And 3 months later, you get what is called the Second Battle of El Alamein. And finally, Rommel is defeated by Montgomery, and now he is chased back again, this time all the way to Tunisia. Okay, so now at this point, the Americans are landing on the other side of North Africa, and they're chasing the Germans and Italians there to Tunisia also. Okay? So east and west, Rommel is caught in this pincer and makes a last stand in Tunisia. Some unsung heroes in all this is the SAS, or David Sterling and his SAS, this commando unit of what you call irregulars, who Auchinleck had initially not agreed to support, but then he does. And this is a brainchild of one guy, David Sterling. He's pretty young. He's 24. He comes from a well-off family with connections, so that matters a lot in England. British military commanders ultimately listen to him. And he's given all the support he needs and zero oversight, which is very rare in war, especially World War II. He's allowed to do whatever he wants, however he wants, on the promise that he can disrupt Rommel by attacking his bases on the coast from the desert. So this is classic asymmetrical warfare. And it helps a lot that Sterling gets in tight with Churchill's son, Randolph. Right? Randolph Churchill. Randolph is kicking around Cairo, not being super productive. and Sterling invites him to come on a raid with them, blow up some planes. He writes home to tell his dad all about this, which is exactly what Sterling had wanted. And also, this is exactly the kind of thing Churchill loves. So he gets his approval. He gets approval from the highest level and continually is resourced throughout the war. Uh, in short, Sterling builds these teams that launch very long distance raids onto Axis airfields from these bases in the desert on the other side of the Qatari Depression, being helped by this long range distance group of modified Jeep drivers who have figured out how to get across this depression that tanks cannot get across. So they're basically their taxi drivers. One of his men, Jacques Luz here, he invents the plastic explosive, which is a putty with diesel in it and then a pencil bomb. And they get into these air bases at night, these airfields on the coast, and then they stick these onto an airplane. And there's enough charge in here to ignite the fuel tanks. So that's the Luz bomb invented here. And it's really these SAS raids that saved Malta. Because it disabled the Italian and German planes that until then had kept the island from any chance of resupply from the German siege. So commando units behind enemy lines, they can do a lot of damage with very little resources, and they'll expand and get used in Europe next, even though Sterling will get captured in Africa. But yeah, if you're interested in more, read this book by Gavin Mortimer, or I really recommend you watch the BBC series Rogue Heroes, which was made in 2022, and it's pretty good. In any event, as I said, the Second Battle of El Alamein coincided with Operation Torch, the American landings in Morocco and Algeria. Hitler then decides to send another 150,000 men to this front, consequential to the American landings, and that puts them on par, the Germans, with the UK's 230,000. And after some drama on the American side, we get this race to Tunisia and the entrapment of the Axis there. Now, what I mean by the drama on that side is this uncertainty of what the Vichy would do. Francois Darlan was a tough negotiator. The Americans are negotiating his surrender when they land, and he will not agree to that unless he is whitewashed of his involvement with the Vichy regime afterwards, and is allowed to keep his appointment. The Americans agree to that, and the Free French are super upset with that decision. In any case, it doesn't really matter because they end up killing him, assassinating him not that long afterwards. So Darlan will be gone. But yeah, really big debate about whether the Vichy have enough loyalty to the Germans to put up a fight here when the Americans land. And as it is, it's a pretty feeble defense, but it's enough for a bit of a delay. The Americans are delayed about 5 days from their rush, their ability to head towards Tunisia, and that gives Rommel enough time to set up defenses there, which ends up becoming a really long delay. In any case, before we go there, just know, yeah, Americans are showing up late in the game, and this is a good place to introduce their Supreme Commander, Ike Eisenhower. Now, Eisenhower is chosen as the head chief over all the Allied forces, British, Commonwealth, Free French. And he's chosen because there's a real tension between the English and the French, so a third party is the best way to go. And he's a great choice. He's a compromiser. He's an excellent communicator. He is even tempered, but not in the way I've talked about earlier. In any case, there's a respect issue between him and Montgomery. Because Eisenhower has less experience in battle, even though he's a career soldier, he was too young to have fought in World War I and really spent 20 years mainly in an office. Eisenhower's problems are not restricted to the British, not by a long shot, because one of his biggest problems is his American general, George C. Patton. And Patton, perhaps is next level in terms of ego. He actually believes he is a reincarnation of several ancient warriors, including Hannibal of Carthage, who famously took his elephants across the Italian isthmus into Rome. He also believes that he's fought under Alexander the Great, and he calls himself the biggest ass kicker in the U.S. Army, which he really believes. He also has this whole image, this persona. He has this custom ivory-handled, nickel-plated revolver, and a uniform that he designs his own uniform, doesn't always wear, but he's completely also bombastic. And he's also very intentional of this. It's a sort of a theatricality by design, based on the fact that he knows his men are afraid. And his feeling is that they respond best to a fearless leader. They will follow that, overcome that. So, and he's right, it seems, and because they do. And so this really is cultivated as well as an authentic personality, especially the part where he's always firing off his substantially sized mouth. And unfortunately, uh, it's often about the Russians. At one point, he says to this group in England that it was the destiny of the United States and Great Britain to rule the post-war world. Now, if you think about it, it couldn't make a worse comment in terms of keeping the alliance together, because this is exactly what Stalin is fearing. And Churchill and Eisenhower and everyone is doing their utmost to keep Stalin on a level of trust, in order that he sticks with it and doesn't sign a separate peace treaty with Hitler. Later on in the war, when it's clear that Germany is done, Patton also says that we should just keep going. The Americans push the Red Army, take Russia down while it's weak, because a future war with them is inevitable, and so it's best fought while the U.S. military is still mobilized. He also wrote this at the time. He says, "I have no particular desire to understand the Russians, except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them. The Russian has no regard for human life, and they are all out sons of bitches, barbarians, and chronic drunks." Perhaps somewhat accurate in some of that. In any case, he kept this in his diary at least. But in any case, it shows you where he's coming from, and what a nightmare he is to handle. And then there's also the problem of conflict between him and British generals, because he's another prima donna. And so Eisenhower has to contend with all of this. And really, a lot of World War II comes down to that, these egos among competing generals. That worst case means poor strategies, so that they can get their own glory, and that also can bring unnecessary death. In that, you might read the book The War Between the Generals by David Irving, okay, because he gets into that. But be aware that Irving is now persona non grata for his troubling ideas about the Holocaust. He's a denier. I don't know if complete denier, look it up. But in that way, to the extent he is, he's a terrible historian, ideological, not empirical. But this book was written by an earlier Irving, and is one of the few books that chronicles the internal fighting, the rivalries, these politics within the Allied high command that were really damaging, especially in the later stages of the war. And we'll see some of that for sure already in Italy. So, result of Operation Torch and the Allies landing here is, well, one thing I didn't mention is the fall of the Vichy regime, because when the Vichy army in Africa joins the Allies, Hitler then invades southern France, and that is the end of Pétain. He's now more than ever a real puppet, right? And France is all occupied. But more importantly, it means that Rommel's Africa Corps is in a pincer. On one end, the Americans in the Commonwealth, on the other end, the British in the Commonwealth. And so Rommel's in full retreat. And the final fight will be in Tunisia in the middle, which is an important place because it is just south of Sicily. Now, the thing about Tunisia is, because of geography, it is well designed to make a defensive stand, and Hitler really believed he would be able to keep the Allies busy here for years. Wrong as it turns out, but it is 7 months, and it's 7 months of intense fighting before the German African Corps surrenders, with a loss of 275,000 men. Huge loss for the Germans here, although Rommel himself is spirited away to Germany 4 days before the inevitable collapse at that point. Right? So what's the effect of all this? Well, one thing is, because of this delay of 7 months, a cross-channel invasion cannot happen anymore in 1943. So the Allies are inevitably being drawn into Churchill's preferred operation, his preferred approach. Too late for a cross-channel invasion this year, unless they sit idle for a year, which makes no sense. So it only makes a lot more sense to take the next step, which is Sicily, preparatory to taking Italy. Okay? The other thing is the Americans are learning something about warfare here. And these are hard lessons that the Americans are learning here, and where the biggest one of those, or the most spectacular failure of the Americans, this inexperience in Green Army, was the Battle of Kasserine Pass in the Atlas Mountains of Tunisia, where Rommel really kicks the stuffing out of the Americans, as you can see here in the numbers. So Americans are learning the hard way how to fight armored war, and soldiers and command are learning a lot of lessons here. Now, if you want to get do a deep dive into what those lessons are, go for it. But it's about distance and artillery versus your soldiers, and their location on the battlefield is largely what it is. But in the wider context, what really matters is the U.S. Army is very green, and because it's expanding so massively. In 1939, there were only 180,000 men in the U.S. Army. By 1943, there are 7 million, so it's grown 40-fold. So this is an important takeaway from the African campaign, as is the saving of Suez and Middle Eastern oil, as is the fact that the Mediterranean is now basically an Allied theater. Finally, more to the point, and perhaps the most important of all is that this long delay over Tunisia, the 7-month delay, meant that 1943 is a non-starter for a cross-channel invasion. The Allies cannot do that this year, so they're being, drawn inevitably into Churchill's preferred approach. Okay? And yeah, too late for a cross-channel invasion in 1943. So unless they sit idle for a year, which is not in the cards, they're going to do the next thing, which is to take Sicily and then a preparatory to taking Italy. Okay, so that is the story and the glory, and I hope it all made sense to you. And yeah, if not, I'm always here for questions. All right, thanks for listening. Take care.